Hi, welcome to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Thanks for joining the conversation. Spencer Ackerman has been a national security correspondent for outlets like The New Republic, Wired, The Guardian, and currently The Daily Beast for nearly the entire war on terror. He is the author of the new acclaimed book, Reign of Terror: How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. As the former U.S. national security editor for The Guardian, Ackerman was part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team reporting on Edward Snowden's surveillance revelations. Spencer is also a major comic book geek and musician, so we had a lot to talk about. I was very excited to talk to him about one of our favorite comic book series, Lazarus by Greg Rucka and Michael Lark. I know I say this all the time, but I learned so much from this conversation. Spencer's insights and ability to articulate the ramifications of the war on terror are superb. It really helped me understand how we got where we are today and provided me with a viewpoint that I had not explored before. He is the publisher of the Forever Wars newsletter on Substack, where he tracks the ongoing course of the war on terror. I highly suggest you check it out. Spencer promises to come back on the show and talk with me more about music and comics, and I can't wait. I'm loving these conversations and hope you are too. If you are, please rate my podcast on your platform of choice and share it with others. If you would like to support with a donation, you can support by visiting my website or patreon.com/sifumimichan. For comments or suggestions, email me at sifumimichan@gmail.com or reach out on social media at sifumimichan. Now, on with the show. Hello, Spencer. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast today.
Mimi, thank you so much for having me. I've been so excited to talk.
Oh my goodness. I'm super nervous. So I'm thrilled to be speaking to you, but also really intimidated because you're like,
no, please don't do
the
that.
Award-winning journalist, and everything I've heard you speak on, you're such like at a high level of expertise, whether it's the war on terror or comics or music. I'm excited to jump in all of those things. But yes, I feel like, wow, I'm a little out of my depth.
Nonsense. I've had so much fun talking in like the couple weeks since randomly we started talking on the internet.
Yes, it's been really cool to see some of your posts and be able to catch some of these little nuances that I'm like, oh, we have things in common. It's always great. But obviously, you've just released this incredibly timely and already acclaimed book. Congratulations, by the way. And you've been on Pulitzer Prize-winning teams and for your work on the Snowden case, but your resume I found interesting has ranged everywhere from dishwashing at a diner to distributing flyers, and you've just done kind of a hodgepodge of things. Is any of those jobs, did any of them kind of prep you for what you're doing right now?
Somewhat. It's an interesting question. I never thought about it like that. I was the sort of person who wanted to do a lot of stuff. And so from the time I was 15 and could legally get my working papers, I was just sort of working. Mm-hmm. And I've done a lot of like very random jobs. If anyone's familiar with the Green Market in Union Square in Manhattan, there was a period of several months where me and another guy who was much older and like nearly 7 feet tall were quote unquote market managers.
Okay.
Which just meant like we spent like the better part of like a 3 or 4 hour shift, like telling people who are on bikes that they had to walk their bikes because babies are around.
Oh, okay. It's kind of like the hall patrol for the Union Square.
Yeah, just like a very strange random job that I found myself doing. And I sort of thought I would do that kind of thing, like, you know, for my life while I like drummed in bands. And so when I needed money, I would do like odd job kind of stuff like that. And instead, like, I got obsessed with this sort of grown-up zine that was an alt weekly in the city called New York Press that people, in particular, this one guy who was much older that I knew from punk rock would write for. And from there, that just like kind of got me at around like age 19, wanting to think like, what if I just did this instead? Because I was like someone who liked to tell stories in like fanzines that I would do. So I guess like I don't like, I could say something like, you know, bussing dishes taught me teamwork, but like,
right.
No, it didn't.
That's
like,
what you'd say at a job interview.
Exactly. Like, no, like, I guess
for
not.
real.
I guess in the sense of like sticking with, not really, I guess that either, because like I would just do these things for like a couple months or in some cases weeks. So, you know.
It just interests me because for me, I've kind of just been a martial artist my entire life. And everyone always asks, like, what has martial arts done for you? I'm like, well, it's my whole life. And so, of course, it's played into everything else I do in my life because it's what I've done. And so I always find it interesting to hear about other people's experiences because I haven't had a zillion other jobs, but I've had other work. But like, I always find it interesting, like, does things matter or play into one another? Or is it just that's the thing I did at that year and then I moved on?
So with a life as a martial artist,
yes,
were you someone who from like a very early age knew what you wanted to do and be?
And here comes the Spencer journalist guy. I was like, how far into the interview before he starts interviewing me? And then I lose control of this. No.
Sorry.
No, this is actually meant to be a dialogue. So it's good. I'm not like a typical show, but yeah, I would say I was very focused when I was about 16. Like before that, I kind of hated Kung Fu when I was 12 and under because I didn't get to play in the neighborhood and do all kinds of other things that other kids did. I had to be at Kung Fu. So as a child, I was still a child. But at 16, I kind of had decided at the same time, there's other things in my life since then I've wanted to do, but I keep getting kind of drawn back into what my roots are and for various reasons. But yeah, I would say it's been interesting since I think if I were just a martial artist, I probably wouldn't just be doing martial arts as my main, life career. But I think it's because it's my father's legacy that puts that kind of not just pressure, but responsibility and then that acceptance of that, like, carrying on that legacy, if that makes sense.
Definitely does.
Yeah. So, and so now I'm a podcaster, which is random. I've done a lot of different things in media, but never anything like this. But ironically, I did start this in 2016 after I felt like having discussions with so many people and wanting to share those like immigrant stories and, building empathy. And I thought that would be my way of helping the situation and also as an outlet to my rage over the election results. So it was kind of combination. And as like the time had progressed, those 4 years were really long. And of course, we're at now. A question I always ask myself is like, how did we get here? And until reading your book, I never thought back to 9/11 as the catalyst, and I never really saw all of the connection of the dots that you so brilliantly draw in your book, of course. And I recommend, of course, everyone to read it, but it's just difficult to digest a lot of those painful truths. And after dissecting those events, so we're jumping into your book now, is like 20 years plus. Which moments do you feel really that you write about stand out for you as like pivotal to leading to the destabilization of America and the rise of 45? I actually hate saying his name. It's like the Beetlejuice kind of thing. So that's why I say 45, but I'm sure there's other words I could use, but I'm trying to be nice. I'm trying to be a kinder person these days. So, but I would love for our listeners, because this is a completely different, I think, audience than a lot of the podcasts that you've been on, aside from your Cerebro, of course, because that's a different audience as well. But I feel like people would be fascinated to kind of hear a little bit of those connective dots, but also kind of what stands out to you as pivotal.
Sure. And thank you for that. I'm grateful for talking to your audience. This is, so I'm a native New Yorker, and a lot of I'm 41 years old. And so as long as I can remember, paying attention to just like local news and things like that, Mr. 45 was always there and always doing.
You can say it, by the way.
Okay, sure.
It's just me.
Well, look, it's your house, so we'll play by your rules. One of the earliest memories I have of this guy, who was like, really, if you didn't grow up in New York or you're not like around that age, like Donald Trump was a really ubiquitous local celebrity.
Yes.
Inserting himself. Like there's been a lot of talk about how like over the years, he's, shifted wildly in one thing or another, but there are more continuities than there are departures. And like the media thirst is a real recurring thing. But so is, and this is very familiar to people who like pay attention to the politics of New York, the real vicious racism expressed in very brutal ways, unconcerned with respectability, and always marshaled for the same purpose. So one of my earliest memories is Trump calling for, in an ad in all of the New York papers, the legal execution of 5 teenage boys who were coerced by police into confessing to a horrific crime they didn't commit.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump, in an ad titled "Bring Back the Death Penalty, Bring Back Our Police," kind of showed you who he is. And in the, that was something that it took me a while to really contextualize in this instance, but one of, I think, the signal moments. There are a lot of moments that you can say, brought us down this path. The Iraq War is one of them. From a kind of wonkier perspective, so are legal changes and official documents, like the authorization to use military force, which after 9/11 inaugurates the global war on terror. But one that I think is really significant and very, I think, misunderstood or misremembered is what's become known as the Ground Zero Mosque. That was a circumstance where, like, a highly respectable local imam who had tended to a community in New York City that's always been here, wanted as a statement of contribution to New York during a period when, it's important to remember, the NYPD had essentially recast itself in the image of the CIA. There were serving CIA officers inside the NYPD's intelligence unit, infiltrating Muslim communities, exploiting kids and older people, opportunists, into becoming informants, spying on mosques, and all of this justified. And this one imam, Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, set up a community center, or sought to, at 45 Park Place, very close to the World Trade Center, something that he wanted to call Cordoba House. Why Cordoba House? Because Cordoba is a glittering jewel in the history of Islamic Europe. This was starting in, I believe, the 8th century, one of the most educated, cosmopolitan, intellectual, thriving, energetic cities in the world under an Islamic emirate. And, to go a little bit, into what, I think really makes it elegant, this kind of statement, was Imam Faisal, who had already written a book entitled "What's Right with Islam is What's Right with America," was saying that we already live in a place like Cordoba. We live in New York City. We live in this thriving cosmopolitan metropolis, one that, always remembers that it's an immigrant city, always refreshing itself with people from all over the world, and people from all over the world learning like to live with each other. Mm-hmm. And then comes the element from after 9/11. Also very deep, and that's why I started with this story about Donald Trump and the Central Park Five. That's also very deeply New York, mm-hmm. which is a racist backlash so vicious, so wrapped in the blood of a city that continues to grieve, for the point of telling their Muslim neighbors that, no, in fact, you don't belong here. Yeah. And when the Cordoba House was transformed into what they called the Ground Zero Mosque, a religious center inside Cordoba House was by no means the central feature of it. It was supposed to be a place kind of like New Yorkers will know, the 92nd Street Y, which is formally a Jewish space, but really open to the whole community in New York that hosts, important conversations and community events and so on. And Donald Trump, as soon as he saw what was happening, as soon as he saw that in the name of stopping a affront to the attacks of 9/11, collapsing the difference between Imam Faisal and Osama bin Laden, doing so deliberately, in such a way that even mainstream outlets like tacitly accepted the framing, and we know this not as the Cordoba House controversy, but the Ground Zero Mosque controversy. They unnamed this intention so thoroughly and replaced it with a very dark vision that they had invented in order to license these sorts of violent sentiments that led to a guy who was driving a cab to being stabbed during this incident. And in the midst, in all of that, inserting himself as he did so often, was Donald Trump, who decided to act like a shakedown artist and go to the project's backers and say, I'm going to buy you out, you're going to take a loss, but then you can just move somewhere else and do this wherever you like. And I think, like, if you're smart, you'll take the money. Mm-hmm. And like, he is doing this precisely to cultivate this current that's sweeping through New York that ultimately New York's power structure would acquiesce to instead of challenge. And over the years, the more I thought back on that episode, particularly after Trump became president, it became more and more a moment that I thought, like, this is the moment where it kind of achieves escape velocity and becomes inevitable, where the response taken as, nearly 10 years after the fact, a kind of vengeance for 9/11 is inflicted after so long being inflicted overseas. It had always also been inflicted at home as well. Yeah. Now it achieved a new kind of intensity following a period of such profound disillusionment with wars that seem nevertheless not to end, because in fact they were not ending.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when that kind of impulse builds up, I think what we see is something like the Ground Zero Mosque phenomenon, and then accordingly later on, the Trump presidency.
Yeah. And it's another thing that kind of reminds me of is just my constant lack of awareness, right? And it's like, I remember when in early 2000, there was a movie that came out, it was called Black Hawk Down, and it was about something that happened in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And I remember watching it. I don't know how accurate it is, but I remember watching it going, oh yeah, I think I remember something about that in the news. And just as Americans, I feel we're very removed from events that don't happen here, right? We kind of don't pay attention, or if we're not reading brilliant books, or if we're not like tuning in to international events and news, we kind of just remove ourselves, and then we also are fed what we are fed, and we're used to just going to those same sources, right? There's kind of that dynamic confirmation bias and whatnot. But what do you recommend, I think, we as Americans try to pay more attention to? Because your book explains so much about what happens that over there affects people here. And obviously, what you just shared, of course, with the Muslim Americans and what their lives were like after 9/11, but also before 9/11. So everyone thinks this is a post 9/11 problem, that suddenly there's racism, right? And it's just like right now with the pandemic. I have been an activist for anti-Asian hate, and people are like, oh, how come there's, it's so sad. If there wasn't the pandemic, we wouldn't have had these anti-Asian sentiments. And this is every person in the BIPOC community is just like throwing their hands up and saying, I don't know one person that hasn't had a story of discrimination, or one person that hasn't had to feel the effects of systemic racism, and constantly having to correct that it isn't just because you're seeing this one event in the news. Now, after that is the effects. Like, this is happening before, this has been happening, continuously, but also what happens in other places directly, affects exactly what's happening here. Is you very much outlined in that book. Is there a certain news station, or should we just be all Substack Forever Wars subscribers? But I just feel like as Americans, we are very removed until it's really smacked into our face, right? We don't really pay attention, and I am just as guilty of that as anyone else.
Well, I think that blaming yourself lets the structural forces that shape that impulse off the hook. So I don't really view it in terms of what it is to have a responsible media diet. I think the fact that lots of people, and I've felt this way myself, take that kind of ownership of this broader structural problem, is that sure is a convenient thing for those who drive the structural problem to encounter. So that's not your fault. That's, the people who own news organizations in the United States' fault. And where, water within those media structures will find its level. I think more important than me recommending any specific outlet is saying that your ability to encounter the news critically, to understand what's not being reported and what's not being framed in a certain way, will improve 1,000-fold if you read history. And there are, lots of. We are recording this at a time right after the Border Patrol in Texas, with what in some photographs looks like delight on the faces of horseback agents using reins as whips on people, on Black people, Haitian refugees. There are so many American antecedents in history that can be read at that moment, but two that I thought of immediately was C.L.R. James's *The Black Jacobins*, one of the greatest books I've ever read. James is a Caribbean Marxist historian writing in the 1930s who gives the history of the Haitian Revolution as it ought to have been told all along. And it's an incredible book. Particularly, I'm from a neighborhood in Brooklyn, Flatbush. It's where I'm from. It's where I still live now. That is blessed to have one of the largest communities in the Haitian diaspora here right alongside me. And the history of Haiti is the history of first, what I would argue is the greatest story in human civilization, the most heroic story in human civilization, of 500,000 people liberating themselves from slavery and from 3 empires and winning. And for the Tacit, and the United States doesn't really count in that weight class at that point, but capital in the United States certainly did. And the story afterward is a story of, as Frederick Douglass said, and the second book I thought of was to read David Blight's recent biography history of Frederick Douglass. As Frederick Douglass said, France and America never stopped punishing Haiti for the crime of liberating itself. And everything we see up till this day, this is history that lives today. Mm-hmm. I heard the vice president talk about, how unacceptable the whippings were at the border, and then talked about Haiti suffering so many natural disasters.
Right, as if just the hurricanes and just the events have been the issue.
Before Afghanistan, the longest war in American history was the United States occupation of Haiti, which also lasted, I think it was specifically 19 years, that was fought entirely for bankers to seize the wealth of Haiti. And this is Citibank in particular, what will become Citibank in particular. Reading history is crucial for appreciating what we see in front of our faces. And, too many great histories to name. But, something that informed my book a lot and also just enriched me to the point of giving me a feeling like I had read a truer history of Western modernity are 4 books by the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, The Age of Revolution, The Age of Capital, The Age of Empires, and The Age of Extremes. And that will take you from 1789 to 1991, and is a tour de force that I spent the summer of 2019 reading. And that's probably enough book recommendations, especially because we started this with you asking me what news people should read.
Well, not necessarily what news, but what we can do. So that more than answers the question, because I just feel like I have these conversations with people and they get to love to throw out their little one headline that they maybe saw across the bottom of the scroll on the screen, or, and it's just, I like to try to be informed. And I always am so frustrated that I don't know what's happening and that, oh my goodness, all these things are happening. There's so many horrors. And in the same way where I may be really informed, I want one thing and I get frustrated with people and I know that I shouldn't be, because it's really not completely their fault, right? Like, you have to actually seek out information if you want it, and it's there. We just have to be a little less lazy about it. But it's funny, your book is described a lot as timely, of course, and I'm sure that you knew that the 20th anniversary of 9/11 was coming, but I'm not sure you knew that the withdrawal from Afghanistan would happen literally at the same time your book released. And also, it feels like it's the book we need right now. When did you start to write it? And did you kind of have planned this release and the timing of it?
No, the exact opposite. It was planned for release in May, and COVID had its impact on the printing supply chain and the people within it. And that meant that it got bumped to August. And I was told things like, all spring books are coming out in the summer. All summer listed books coming out in the fall. Okay. And, as journalists, we kind of have to come to terms with, materially benefiting from the world's horrors. So that kind of nausea-inducing element is just kind of, there in this life that I have chosen. So, if it helped people contextualize what they were seeing in front of them, then I'm grateful for that. And I feel like I'll have done my job. I started writing I came up with the book around Thanksgiving of 2018, as I had done a couple recent stories for the Daily Beast, where I was working at the time, that sort of helped me see the intersection of Trump and the war on terror as it was coalescing. And the first one of these was Trump nominating Gina Haspel to be CIA director. Mm-hmm. Gina Haspel is a CIA torturer. And those of us who have covered this beat for a very long time know that she is among the premier of the 9/11 generation within the CIA. There are many people from that, for lack of a better term, like class within the CIA that are fiercely loyal to her, that view her as a hero when the agency needed it the most, by doing things like first overseeing the end stage of the torture of the first person the CIA tortured, Abu Zubaydah, and the early stages of the second person they tortured, Abdul Rahim al-Nashri. And from there, she went on to, as the CIA's lead attorney, John Rizzo, writes in his memoir, before retracting it entirely after I called him about that, Gina Haspel ran the interrogation program at the CIA, by which we mean the torture and kidnapping program. Mm-hmm. And she had helped cement that loyalty by doing things like destroying videotaped evidence of the torture of these two men in this black site that she ran. And that, through a circuitous series of events, is the reason why the Senate Intelligence Committee ended up very belatedly investigating the CIA for torture at all. Long story short, you already know the answer to this. There's no accountability for any of that. And when Trump nominated Gina Haspel to be CIA director, it was such a mask-off moment, not just for him, but for the kind of hashtag resistance to Trump amongst liberals that had really begun and intensified online. And I say this because so much of that, both hashtag resistance and never Trumper resistance to Trump, quickly called a timeout and said, this is a really smart, responsible move to hire someone who's such a devoted institutionalist to run the CIA. So what they would kind of say, quietly was he could have gotten another Mike Pompeo. He could have had Tom Cotton run the CIA. Yeah. Trust me, I'm from the CIA. This is better. I know Gina, she has integrity, and so on and so forth. And these are people whom I think well-intentioned liberals are kind of looking to, because their media sources use them as validators within the CIA, within the intelligence apparatus, within the FBI, within the military, as sort of a kind of patriotic core, which is certainly how they would like to portray themselves. And here they are together applauding Trump for putting a torturer that they know and like at the head of the CIA. And this was also a moment where, if I can just sort of say this, not a lot of media outlets were focusing on that, or were framing it like that, were saying with kind of urgency, I wrote a piece with a headline taken from one of the quotes from human rights activists I talked to who have tracked the torture program. She should be in jail. A sizable contingency was lining up behind someone to whom a statement like that applied. And Trump, all the while, pocketing the applause of his, nominal adversaries, and publicly saying, Gina, stay, fight, and win this thing.
Yeah.
As a way of trying to show the CIA that it had nothing to fear from him, and that it would, only expect, and this is something that Mike Pompeo, when he was CIA director, kind of talked obliquely about in his few public appearances, that if the CIA wanted to do stuff like that, they would have a president who would entirely support that, and not one who would recoil from it once it became public. And that was a really important moment. The other was in around like October 2018, I looked into, to the degree, because all of this is an official secret, people who track this stuff from the outside can, into Trump and drone strikes, and found that before the second year of his presidency was over, Trump had surpassed Obama in terms of launching drone strikes. The first 2 years of Obama's presidency were the high water mark of a method of killing people that Obama became synonymous with. And Trump had surpassed that. And similarly, again, there was not a lot of, pickup from that story. There wasn't a lot, a number of people, wrote their own versions of that as well after, but it didn't really seem to like break through into a broader consideration in large part because Trump, and then accordingly media reacting to Trump, were constantly framing Trump and his relationship to the war on terror in exactly the way Trump wished, which was that he was, as Maureen Dowd of the New York Times wrote, Donald the Dove. That somehow a guy who's talking about bombing the shit out of people, who has as one of his first acts in office, in order to stop the entrance into the country from millions of people from Muslim majority countries, and then North Korea and Venezuela sprinkled in. So the Supreme Court pretends that this isn't what it actually is. The brutality at the border and the brutality within communities inside the country from an immigration authority that had gotten a functional transformation and a mandate and a much larger budget because now it was within a counterterrorism agency. And around like Thanksgiving of 2018, I just had all of this kind of, front of my mind because I had been working on it. And it just made me increasingly a little bit like tetchy when I would, hear explanations for Trump, many of them very, very good and historically informed that I think are correct, particularly my friend Adam Serwer's explication of the ways in which Trump echoes, harnesses, and utilizes very deep patterns of American white nationalism. But none of these explanations on offer really had anything to say about the fact that for 20 years now, America had constantly been at war disastrously with an ever-changing enemy against which enormous government and media lies were told, and who in practice, and which in practice, from the start, renders identifiably non-white people in America, many of them American citizens, as people to whom the law binds but does not protect.
Yeah.
And the ways in which the architectures of that spread, entrenched themselves as specific acts of elites ensured, and then a democratic administration, once it finally achieves power in 2009, also entrenches, acquiesces to, perpetuates, innovates, and in particular, convinces itself that it is more lawful and more ethical if only it conducts these operations less conspicuously and under greater secrecy.
Yeah.
And the more I started thinking about it like that, the more I sort of thought of Trump less of a departure from what had come before in the war on terror and more of a lagging indicator that after enough punches to the structural foundations that are already like waterlogged of what we call American democracy, eventually they're going to be in such weak shape that they are not going to be able to keep out figures like Trump. And we've seen figures like Trump in American history, and that's as the result of figures like Trump throughout American history, there, either is or needs to be, most often is just, continued neglect, refreshing of the institutions that safeguard freedom and make democracy possible. And all of this looked to me, as I went into it, as a way also of finally understanding the only thing that I've ever reported on for my entire career.
Yeah. Wow. It's a fantastic read. And like I said, it's painful, but it really helped bring so much insight for me. So thank you for that. And it highlighted so many things that resonated with me also as an Asian American, and just kind of that experience, especially bringing to light a lot of the things about the torture that I really maybe subconsciously stayed away from wanting to know about, because it was just so graphic and horrible. But of course, there's a lot of things, especially right now, that are dividing us here globally in this nation as neighbors. I'm in Florida, so apologies to everyone again for Florida being Florida. But right now, Texas is beating us. So I'm kind of like, yay for Texas, like actually making us look not as horrible. But anyway, there are a lot of things that bring us together. And I always talk about that being food and art, meaning comics and music and fun things. And I was, no offense, but determined to talk to you after I heard you mention Lazarus. Not that I didn't think your book was amazing. And of course, we've just spent like a good part of the show talking about it. So obviously I think it's great. But I was like, wait, he just recommended Greg Rucka's Lazarus on the Ezra Klein show. I need to talk to that guy. Because I have such a love for that comic. And then of course I explored, and you are beyond a X-Men expert, and I am totally not going to be able to hold my own in that conversation. And you really go into it on Cerebro, which by the way is my husband's one of his new favorite podcasts, and because of you, and he's been listening to it, and he just totally geeks out. He's a huge X-Men fan. And speaking of which, you wrote something in one of your blogs recently that I want to read, but also it resonated with my husband on like that reverse level. He is of Dominican descent, and you wrote, probably one of the most subversive and powerful ideas in the superhero comics medium is the presentation of heroic stories about an expressly dedicated group of marginalized people who have to face and deal with oppression from the overclass, have to learn to move in those worlds and struggle with what it is to be free. And then you went on to explain like that gave you so much insight, especially if you're not one of those marginalized groups. And for my husband, he always shares that he grew up reading X-Men as a kid, as a Dominican kid in Brooklyn, in East New York, and in a household that didn't speak English. And that really helped his comprehension of the language, but also understanding and feeling understood. And so he had this connectivity to it. I think that really bookends what you just really eloquently wrote. And I'd love to kind of talk about that, because I just feel like that's so interesting that I read that to him. And then he's reading your newsletter as well. And he shared that with me. And I thought, wow, yeah, it's funny because there was a time where comics were just for geeks. And now it's kind of this cool thing. And then there's movies and whatnot. But I feel like there's so much depth to comics that people don't get. And obviously you get it.
Well, I grew up, like I said, I'm 41. So when I was reading this stuff as a kid, this was the, mid-late 80s. So for a lot of that, particularly when I was catching up, because my cousins had some, the point of view character was a young Jewish kid who is not much older than I was. Kitty, now Kate Pride. Mm-hmm. And, having that, point of identification, going into an atmosphere where like the team is led by Storm, who's an African-American woman. Colossus is Russian. Wolverine is Canadian. Obviously, like there was not, super much non-white representation early on in the X-Men, but like in New Mutants, their teen book, there was Danny Moonstar was Cheyenne, Shan Kwon Man, Karma is Vietnamese, Roberto da Costa, Sunspot, is biracial Brazilian. Anyway, the point is that like it was a way of like instructing kids in like what we would now understand as intersectionality of a sort. But I think what works and resonates on an emotional level is that like it teaches you solidarity.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is also really like set the X-Men as a franchise kind of apart from the rest of comics, because that's kind of a place where that can happen. It doesn't happen evenly. It doesn't happen universally. It certainly doesn't happen automatically. But for creators who are interested in stories like that, it's a perfect vehicle. And the line has just never been better than it is right now. But I mentioned Lazarus on the podcast because like it is absolutely, I think I'm just saying this because it's the Clash reference, but the only comic that matters. I just simply can't. Every Greg Rucka, Michael Lark page is a blessing of insight and a deep structural exploration and exhumation of the world that not just is coming, but we're on a glide path toward, like at times seeming like in real time.
Yes, I know. We often in our sphere of like, because we've been fortunate. I don't know how I got so lucky. I got to like podcast with him every week during the pandemic, and we were like, we're not sure we like your predictivity of like how predictable you're making your comic is becoming like reality, and it's scary, especially as you see things like the billionaire space race and how literally the world is, run by wealth, not necessarily other factors. There are other factors, but wealth was one of the big things. He likes to cover greed and wealth and how that can be dangerous. But it's funny how I'm like, you're kind of predicting things and it's scary. Can you please write that everyone lives happily ever after at the end? But then that would make for a very good Lazarus. But we're worried everything Greg writes becomes reality, and it's so scary. But I love that you love this because I feel like it's an overlooked book. I feel like it's an overlooked series.
I mean, it's going to get like pretty scary to talk about how much I love this book, because like I debated, like, should I wear my family's, belong together?
Okay, we need to go put it on and then get a picture.
I won't stop this. I will send you a picture later. I am lucky enough to have gotten 2 letters in Forever Yours, and I have the Carlisle patch sewn on my flight jacket accordingly. So yeah, like before I logged into your Zoom chat.
Yes.
I was rereading I think 2 of my favorite issues, which are the Jonah Carlisle intercalary chapter in 27 and 28.
Oh, heart-wrenching.
And then, leading in especially to the overture in Risen 1 in the Acklak territory, that, is just such a perfect curtain raise for like this new act of this, incredibly cinematic story that is now proceeding. I'll just say, because, I went back after you got in touch and listened to a couple of your episodes with Greg Rucka. And I was at, it was on Sunday when I heard your most recent one.
Okay.
And I was at
we talked about you.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm at the playground with my kids, and I'm bothering my wife. Like, you gotta hear what they said. Like, Greg Rucka's talking about my book. Like, it's like he, not sure if he can use my first name. Greg, you can call me whatever you like.
He's so polite. He's so proper. I was like, oh, I've been texting with Spencer. We're pals now, I think. Oh, yes.
So thank you for that. That was really an amazing thing to hear. And you know, I don't, you know, I would like probably, it's probably for the best that I not like go on the Discord. But, you know, I don't know what the, you know, reception is, but I will just say, speaking for myself as someone who I think can be, you know, fairly accredited, a fan of this series, take as long as you like for every single issue. Like, I am not worried. Like,
Yeah,
you know,
right?
I see on the page the result of all of that work, and I respect, you know, every time I hear, you know, Greg Rucka, if I can call you Greg, I don't know, you know, talk in interviews about it, you know, apologetically. I respect where that's coming from, the dedication that it shows and the respect for the audience that it conveys. But just speaking as someone who I just think my mind and my imagination has been so enriched by Lazarus that I feel grateful that I get any of this at all. And the schedule that it that requires, particularly when, you know, events like this intercede, we're probably not seeing the last pandemic of our lifetimes.
Right. It's the forever pandemic.
Yeah, like let's you know, hawk flu, man. It was so hard not to.
I said, really, Craig? Really? The hawk flu and then COVID? I was like,
yeah, that was just so much to take in. But you know, what are your kind of signature? What are the moments in Lazarus that resonate with you to the point that, like, you would say, like, this is what got you hooked on this and got you invested?
Yeah, well, so, you know, at first you're just reading and you have this badass, really cool chick with a sword who I'd identify with, of course, because she's got a sword. And so naturally, but beyond that, there's just so many layers, you know. And one of the first conversations Greg and I had, which was in his home, by the way, I was like freaking out about that, of course. It was like amazing. And was that at the end of it, it was, especially in those early issues, is just a story about abuse. And as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, it maybe subconsciously even was just like hitting those notes of that, you know, that survival, but that empathy and just kind of all those feelings kind of coming through. But the activism, actually, I told Greg, I'm like, I love Lazarus, but like the Forever Yours letters at the back were one of my favorite things to get to, because I just love Rucka rants. I just like when he kind of goes on his Rucka rants, and he got me to start signing petitions, and he got me to start signing up for things. And he blushes all the time and says, "Oh, don't do that. You're the one doing the work." But he's made me an activist from a comic book, from Lazarus, awesome. from you know, he ignited this thing. I am literally writing a bill to include AAPI history in Florida's education system right now. I don't know if it'll pass, but that's what I'm doing, right? And this is directly related to that. But the Jonah story, what I love about Lazarus is he takes characters that you can like hate and want to die at the beginning of the issue, at the beginning of the series. And then halfway through, you're crying for them. You feel for them because you realize like he's just does this masterful way of wielding your emotions through characters that you never thought you would feel things for, or like, obviously we're always rooting for Forever. She's the hero and we're, you know, but it's the characters like Jonah and even, Johanna and just all of the Carlyles, actually, except for Malcolm so far. I haven't found I haven't found any Malcolm moments yet, but like I just couldn't believe after the whole, you know, him trying to blow Forever up and all of that to, like you said, 27, 28, where you're almost crying for him. Like, I couldn't believe that I have totally 360, like turned around from what I thought I felt for these characters. So I think it's just the attachment to these characters and just seeing like their evolution, but it's not even their evolution. It's like a reveal, right, of who they really are and why they're there and how we got there. And so I just love that. And it's just so much fun. And yeah, I think it's just this last issue Man, it was intense, and and you know, you're getting Abby. Thank God she's really short, because there was a time that I gave Greg a little bit of grief about, like, why did you cut Forever's hair like Marisol? Because on the page you were kind of like, wait, who is this? Because they're both like strong, you know, muscular women, but at least Abby's like tiny, so it's very easy to determine who's who.
You know, in that first issue, even though she's on the cover
Me too.
with the short hair, I was like, is Marisol, because is like Forever so messed up from the dragon that like Marisol is acting as the Lazarus? Like, what's happening?
And it's not Michael's fault, because Michael was like, you know, she's going to look like Marisol. So it's not Michael. Greg was very intentional about it. We had an episode where we talked about it, and it was funny because he was like, well, you know, that was like her dad. And, you know, maybe that was my subconscious way of saying like homage to Marisol. But he's like, I don't think I was being that intentional. I agree. Michael was right. It confused people. But aside from that, I mean, if that's the one criticism I have, oh my God. Yeah, I love it. And so when I heard you on Ezra Klein, I got on the Discord. I was like, oh my God, you're going to freaking believe this. Spencer Ackerman's talking about Lazarus. And they're like, oh, he's a fan, you know? And I was like, I must talk to him.
Oh, I'm so glad you did.
Yeah.
You know, for me, I think, you know, if it isn't the moment in issue 1 where Forever executes the innocent man who comes forward to spare his family, it's the whole story in the second arc, Lift, where, like, reading that, I was like, I will, you know, watching
like Casey and the family.
Yes, exactly. And like watching them go from, like, you know, being forced through mechanisms they can't control, but ever-present financialization, into losing everything they have, into all of their wealth being extracted to the family anyway. They see themselves as having no choice but to undergo this devastating migration in order to enter a reality show that determines if they have a future or not. And at that moment, I was just like, wherever this, I was already kind of, you know, I was going to buy this because I liked it so much from the start, but I was like, wherever this goes, I will follow. And later on, seeing that amazing page, I think it's in one of the X+66 issues, where we first see San Francisco in its fullness, and we see how enormous these shanty towns have become. And they put me in mind, not just of like the few times I've been to San Francisco, not just the few times I've been to San Francisco, but also the drive from the Kabul airport toward either central Kabul or about an hour or so further, the Bagram airfield. You would see these, the further you got from the airport and like, you know, bucolic areas, these enormous like hills that just build more and more ersatz housing, improvised however it can be, on top of one another, going up enormous hills, like incredibly dense. And it just, the moment I saw that panel, I thought, like, this is what I saw in Kabul.
Wow. From
people who had taken refuge from a war that was not primarily waged in the capital city. And, you know, on the next trip I took to Kabul, it was even denser because 2 years had passed and things had only deteriorated.
Yeah. And speaking of the family, I was just curious what your thoughts are on the Barretts. Like, are they joining a revolution? And what do you think is going to happen with them?
What I enjoy about the way the book is going, and the way it's treated the worlds of both the serfs and the waste, is that, you know, there isn't so much of a kind of grand story because people have to survive and they make the choices that they see as necessary in order to endure circumstances that, most often they will not meaningfully be able to redress, and they can only mitigate. And that's what I took, strongly from the story of the Solomons, particularly from Lyft. And every moment that I see, Michael or Casey with family members, I'm just like, run the fuck away. Like, you're not people to these people. Run away.
Like when they were at that dinner party. And
it's so tense. But the thing that I love so much right now, particularly after 6, I will not be caught having feelings for Jacob Hawk. I hate a lot of people too, but I can't imagine torturing their children.
Yeah.
So we have to keep that, that among everything else we have to keep in mind.
Yeah. Certain sins are never forgiven kind of thing.
And at that point, it's not really about whatever happened with him and Malcolm and Abby.
Yes.
It's about something that exists within him.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading I just started yesterday reading Orhan Pamuk's novel, My Name is Red. Have you read that?
No, I haven't.
There's this fantastic moment. I'm only on page 25, and it's already one of the best novels I can bet. I can just tell you, Orhan Pamuk is, after reading 25 pages of his fiction, is clearly one of the greatest fiction writers alive. But he has this wonderful moment. There's a moment where the unnamed character at the start who commits the murder that is central to this novel says a couple things like, I'm not going to really describe things about me because then you'll figure it out. Just enjoy going on this ride of figuring out who I am and why I did this thing. Okay. I'll tell you a lot about why I did it, but now try and figure it out. And it's oh, this is why Lazarus is consistently proving how incredible it is. Because all of these moments that Greg brings back unlock all of these earlier moments, and that Michael brings to life and paces so perfectly.
Oh, so perfectly.
The relationship now between, the fact that there was warmth shown immediately between Abby and Hawk is something I need to know about. The J names of all of the children. Is that Abby spiting Malcolm? Because there seems to be that kind of connection drawn with Jonah, Johanna.
Yeah.
That seems like if you absolutely if your life is in many ways predicated on saying fuck Dr. Hawk, that's quite a thing to name your children, names that are vaguely reminiscent of his own.
Yeah. Oh God, I've never even thought about that. My mind is exploding now.
This could entirely be a total.
I feel like we're going to need to do another episode where we keep going and we go through each issue. But I mean, Greg keeps saying 7. Wait till 7 because everything, it's going to be that end of a huge arc. So much will be revealed. I'm like, why would you tell me this? It's just making me crazy. Because I thought 6 was huge. Such a reveal.
Six is clearly one of the most important issues of the entire series.
Yeah, so much is coming together.
From one of your earlier interviews, I think I remember Greg saying that they are kind of in an endgame scenario that they're barreling toward the conclusion of Lazarus, however long that takes is however long that takes. But hearing that we're kind of in an endgame, we're in the reaping stage. We've sufficiently fucked around and we're about to find out, or we're increasingly finding out, is something that's also very exciting for me, even if it'll be, bittersweet. I want to live in all the source books. Yeah. I hope that, even after, the main narrative may be completed, what's up with Myers Cassimy? How did Myers Cassimy get to be this binational union of the Gulfies in Israel? I'm very interested in that.
Yes. And all the Lazarite, like they're all so cool and have their own special things happen. I mean, and I like the X66, how we get these little tidbits about, different characters and stuff. And there's just so much, but I know he keeps going, we're going to need a break. And this could be because I said, is it going to be like kind of like Saga where it's like a break, I think after 7. So I'm going to keep goading him though, to keep going. And I'm always in the Discord, everyone's always lamenting over the fact that, the TV show was going to be, and then it's not going to be. And then but maybe it's for the best. Like maybe we want to be done. I don't know, but we all want more Lazarus. So I love that. And I love that this essentially has brought us together, but I know we have to wrap up because you're short on your time, but as I went down the rabbit hole of Spencer, I was like, what? You like 90s hip hop from Brooklyn? And I mean, there was just so many things that I kept telling my husband, I'm so excited to speak to you. And honestly, he should be on this call because he's the X-Men expert, and he'll be mad if he heard me say that right now. He's like, don't say that. But he's heard a lot of X-Men.
Well, let's all talk sometime.
Yeah. And then of course, like growing up in East New York. And I mean, that was one of the things that connected us. Like we both liked hip hop at the time. And just the music scene, the fact that you're so entrenched in that. So, we didn't really get to dive into it too much, but I love your music background and the very cool single you released on the drums with Ted. And how cool was that?
That was wild. That was just entirely a thing I thought was just never like possible. And then suddenly it happened. What this is one of the best singer-songwriters in punk rock, Ted Leo, contacted me. We very vaguely know each other. We have some people in common, but primarily have interacted online, and asked if he could read the audiobook. Mm-hmm. And I told him that it really hurt that I was going to have to turn that down because I was so invested in reading the audiobook myself. Mm-hmm. Like a whole lot of how this book got written is me pacing in a room with what I had just written and quietly saying it to myself out loud. Yeah. So I could get kind of the rhythm of it and get that right and see what sounded off, see what kind of didn't work. So I wanted to do that with the audiobook. And then we started talking about other, ways of collaborating. And long story short, he read the book in galleys and then wrote a song, a really incredible song, a really good Ted Leo song, inspired by it. There are some lines in the book and imagery in the book that Ted turned into lyrics, which is a blessing in my life that I didn't think I could experience. And then permitted me, despite, only ever being in bands that did nothing and them not really having existed for, with one exception, 20 years, I got to play drums on that song and got one of my dearest friends, Sue Werner, who's the bassist of the incredible band from Baltimore, War on Women, who are about to be on tour with Alkaline Trio and Bad Religion, to play bass on that. And so that was a tremendous amount of fun. One of another dear friend of mine, Jesse Cannon, engineered that, as he has for most of the music I've ever recorded. So that was a pretty amazing thing. That was something that I did not expect the book to yield. But, if you get the chance to do that, how could you turn it down?
Oh my gosh, so amazing. And it was so much fun. And when I heard it, I got the newsletter and it came out. It was super exciting. I'm like, what is this? Not only did you do the audiobook, you've got a music track, you've got your own song inspired by already. And yeah, it was very, very cool. Very cool.
And also for accountability, I should also say, we'll be posting an update about this shortly. When we released the song, the only place it was available was to subscribers of my Substack, Forever Wars. And as we're recording this, that remains the case, or is about to change and be available under Ted's name, Ted Leo. The song's called Into the Conquering Sun. And while we had that period where the only place you could hear it was through paying for my Substack. We figured we would do something with that. And so all of the money that people put up to subscribe during this period, one tranche of it has already been donated. The second will be to two organizations in Texas that are providing abortion access, in particular to teenagers who are and could become pregnant, and also to migrant people who are in that circumstance as well and already have to deal with persecution from CBP and from ICE.
Awesome.
So we'll be putting up a receipt list about that. I imagine by the time this comes out, the song will be in wide release. But I just want to thank everyone who signed up for the Substack, who contributed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm going to get a promise from you now to come back, talk comics, music again with me.
I would love to.
Go into deep dive of that. Not that I didn't love talking about your book, but it's a little bit of a downer.
It is a downer. I'll tell you, there was this, I don't blame anyone. There was a period like earlier in the year when I had to do like some final edits on the draft. And like, this is like after I'm already tired from my day job and tired from being a father of, at that point, a 5-year-old and a newborn, that I just like had my laptop late at night in bed and I'm going through this. And I just like stopped for a second and was like, I don't want to read my book like right before I go to sleep. Like, this is just too depressing.
I always tell people, don't try to read it in bed, like to make sure it's like, earlier in the day. It could get your mind just turning. So yeah, it's definitely not a bedtime story.
Yeah, really not.
Oh my gosh.
Mimi, thank you so much. I had such a great time.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. And I know that we will be talking again soon.
I hope so. And you definitely have my commitment to come back anytime you would like. Thank you so much.
Yay.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to The Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review. You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/SifuMimiChan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.